I begin with an act of plagiarism, as my talk today reappropriates and redeploys a question that Czech-Brazilian media theorist Vilém Flusser once used for a book he published in 1987. At the time Flusser was writing, the dominance of the written word seemed to be in crisis, as new modes of digital expression seemed to herald the end of writing and the beginning of a post-literate age. I rewrite Flusser's question 35 years later, because it again looks as if writing's future is in question and on the line. This time due to impressive developments in large language models and other forms of generative artificial intelligence. It is in the face of these 21st century innovations that we now find ourselves once again asking seemingly apocalyptic questions about writing and its future. Thus, it seems prudent to once again reissue Flusser's titular question, does writing have a future? And we can, following Flusser's example, begin with a very direct statement. What large language models signify is not the end of writing, but the terminal limits of a particular conceptualization of writing that has been called logocentrism. In other words, writing indeed has a future, but only if we reconceptualize how we think about writing and write about thinking. So here's my plan of attack. I will begin by briefly characterizing three defining characteristics of logocentric metaphysics. In part 2, I will then investigate how large language models disrupt logocentrism by releasing a deconstruction of its organizing principles. Finally, part 3 then will formulate the terms and conditions of an alternative way to think and write about large language models and generative AI that escape the conceptual grasp of logocentrism and its hegemony. One of the main complaints or criticisms directed against large language models, like OpenAI's ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude, is that these technologies generate seemingly intelligible statements, but do not and cannot understand what it is they are saying. Versions of this have proliferated in both the academic and popular media. Consider the following explanation offered by Ian Bogost in an op-ed for The Atlantic. ChatGPT, he writes, lacks the ability to truly understand the complexity of human language and conversation. It is simply trained to generate words based on a given input, but it does not have the ability to truly comprehend the meaning behind those words. Or a similar statement from the linguist Emily Bender in a profile published in New York Magazine. The models are built on statistics. They're great at mimicry and bad at facts. Why? Large language models have no access to real-world embodied reference. If the terms of these critical reappraisals sound familiar, they should. It's just good old-fashioned logocentric metaphysics. Now, logocentrism is a term that was originally coined by the German philosopher Ludwig Klages in the early 1900s. It refers to the tradition in Western science and philosophy that regards words and language as fundamental expressions of an external reality. We don't have time for a deep dive into the history and consequences of this influential way of thinking. Instead, I will just note three characteristics that are already in play and operationalized by the current conversations and debates regarding large language models. First, there is a hierarchy of words and things, and that hierarchy is initially arranged and organized by Aristotle in De Interpretatione. And Aristotle writes this: spoken words are the symbols of mental experience, and written words are the symbols of spoken words. Just as all men have not the same writing, so all men have not the same speech sounds. But the mental experiences, which these directly symbolize, are the same for all, as also are those things of which our experiences are the images. Thus, there are things which by way of our senses produce images in the mind. These are then represented by spoken words, which are subsequently represented by written signs. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, yeah, that's just obvious. That thought is itself evidence of the extent to which Logocentrism is the basic operating system of our usual ways of thinking. Second, writing is a technology. Unlike speech, which is considered to be a natural and inherent capability of the human species and a direct symbol of thought, writing is artificial, external, and technical. As Walter Ong explained in the book Orality and Literacy, writing, and especially alphabetic writing, is a technology, calling for the use of tools and other equipment. By contrast with natural oral speech, writing is completely artificial. And it is for this reason that writing is already situated as a form of artificial intelligence. As Plato has Socrates say in the Phaedrus, and so it is with written words. You might think they spoke as if they had intelligence, but if you question them, wishing to know about their sayings, they always say only one and the same thing. Third, writing is useful only to the extent that it is an instrument of expression. As a secondary and derived representation of speech, what matters most with writing is what its progenitor intended to say. Derrida explains it this way. If for Aristotle, spoken words are the symbols of mental experience, and written words are the symbols of spoken words, it is because the voice, producer of the first symbols, has a relationship of essential and immediate proximity with the mind. Producer of the first signifier, it is not just a simple signifier among others. It signifies mental experiences, which themselves reflect or mirror things by natural resemblance. And if we ask the question, what is it Derrida is trying to say here? That very question, a mode of inquiry which seeks to discover what an author is saying in by the instrumentality of the writing, that is logocentrism par excellence. So the fundamental challenge or the opportunity with large language models and generative AI systems like OpenAI's ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude, Google's Gemini, you name it, is that these algorithms write without speaking, without having access to the logos, and without an embodied living voice. In response to this seemingly monstrous problem, contemporary critiques, like those offered by Bogost, Bender, and many others, proceed from and reassert the truth of logocentric metaphysics with little or no critical hesitation. These algorithms, they argue, might be able to arrange words in seemingly intelligible orders, but they do not know what it is they are saying. Consequently, the problem is not that logocentrism has somehow failed to work in the face of these new technologies of writing. It's quite the opposite. The problem is that logocentrism works all too well, exerting its influence over our thinking about writing and writing about thinking in ways that go by largely without notice. What makes large language models so important and interesting is that they disrupt this way of thinking, and they do so in at least 3 ways. First, large language models undermine the very notions of authority, authorship, and accountability. When confronted with any written document, one of the first questions we ask is who wrote it, and who can therefore be responsible for what has been written. Responses to these questions have typically been resolved by identifying the author, who, it is commonly assumed, speaks to us through the instrumentality of the text. But, as Michel Foucault explained in the aptly titled essay, What is an Author?, this concept is not some naturally occurring phenomenon. It was a literary and legal affordance deliberately fabricated at a particular time and place in an effort to determine and decide who is speaking. The author, as Roland Barthes explained, is a modern figure, a product of our society insofar as emerging from the Middle Ages with English empiricism, French rationalism, and the personal faith of the Reformation, it discovered the prestige of the individual, of, as it is more nobly put, the human person. Prior to this modern and distinctly European innovation, Barthes contends, there were perhaps writers or generators of text, but no authors, as we currently understand that term. And like many theorists of his time, such as Marcel Mauss, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Barthes also employs the critical foil provided by 20th century anthropological discoveries. In ethnographic societies, he writes, the responsibility for a narrative is never assumed by a person, but by a mediator, shaman, or relator whose performance, the mastery of the narrative code, may possibly be admired, but never his genius. Outside of the experiences and traditions of European modernism, narratives have been successfully developed, performed, and accumulated without necessarily needing what is called the author. But if the author, as the principal figure of literary authority and accountability, comes into existence at a particular place and at a specific moment in time, there is also a point at which it would cease to fulfill this role. It is this disappearance and withdrawal of what had been the principal figure of literary authority that is announced and marked by Barthes's seemingly apocalyptic title, Death of the Author. What this phrase indicates is not the end of life of any particular individual or the end of human writing, but the terminal limits of the figure of the author as the authorizing agent and guarantee of what is said in and by writing. Though Barthes and Foucault obviously did not address themselves to large language models, their work on the author function anticipates our current situation with algorithmically generated content. What we now have with large language models are writings without the underlying intentions of some embodied living voice to animate and answer for what comes to be written. Consequently, such writings are quite literally unauthorized. But instead of this being a criticism concerning what these AI-generated texts lack, it shows us the extent to which the authority for writing, any writing, whether human or machine, has always and already been a socially constructed artifice. Thus, as Bernard Stiegler writes, this is the kind of unauthorization where we have an authority without an author, and it inheres in all forms of writing as techniques. Second, this affects the means of meaning. Once the text is cut loose from the controlling interests and intentions of an author, the question concerning significance gets turned around. Specifically, the meaning of a piece of writing is not something that can be guaranteed a priori by the authentic character or ethos of the one who is assumed to be speaking through the medium of the text. Instead, meaning transpires in and from the process of reading and interpreting. And if it is the case that this significance had been customarily attributed to an author, that attribution is and has always actually and only been projected backwards from the reader onto a supposed and oftentimes absent author. Meaning making, in other words, is an effect of reading that is then retroactively presupposited to become its own presumed cause. This flipping of the script on modern literary theory changes the location of meaning making from the original intentions of the author or the writer who has something to say to the interpretive activity of the reader who makes meaning in or generates it out of the materiality of the written content. As Barthes explains, text is made of multiple writings drawn from many cultures and entering into mutual relations of dialogue, parody, contestation. But there is one place where this multiplicity is focused, and that place is the reader. A text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination. Thus, the meaning of a text, whether it is written by a human author, generated by a large language model, or assembled from the productive interaction and collaboration of both, is situated in the interpreting and meaning-making that is produced in and by reading. Logocentric literary theory actually has had things backwards and upside down. This also explains how AI-generated content comes to have meaning. The critics are correct when they point out, for instance, that ChatGPT lacks the ability to truly understand the complexity of human language and conversation. But it would be impetuous for us to conclude from this fact that what the AI generates is nonsense, meaningless, or bullshit. These writings are meaningful, and what they mean is something that happens in the process of our reading, interpretation, and evaluation of the generated content. And this fact is not something that is specific to large language models, but it is, as Bart points out originally, a defining characteristic of all writing. Finally, the issue is not where meaning is located and produced. What is at issue is the concept of meaning itself. Beginning with Aristotle and persisting in the current critique of AI technology, language has been assumed to consist of signs that refer and defer to a signified. When we write the words large language model, for instance, it is assumed that those linguistic tokens stand for and refer to some real thing out there in the world, like the ChatGPT application developed by OpenAI. The signification sign, Derrida explains, has always been understood and determined in its meaning as sign of, a signifier referring to a signified, a signifier different from its signified. Therefore, words have meaning because someone, like an author, who we assume is an embodied human person with access to the real world outside language, uses words to refer to and say something about things. And the big problem with large language models is they simply lack this ability. They manipulate words and linguistic tokens without knowing or caring what these signs refer to. But the seemingly common sense view of how language works is not necessarily the natural order of things, and it has been directly challenged by 20th century innovations in structural linguistics, which sees language and meaning making as a matter of difference, situated within the materiality of language itself. Signs, therefore, do not, at least not principally and or exclusively, come to have meaning by direct reference to things that exist outside the system of signs. Signs refer to and differ from other signs. And it's the dictionary that provides what is perhaps one of the best illustrations of this basic semiotic principle. In a dictionary, words come to have meaning through their differential relationship to other words. In pursuing the meaning of words in the dictionary, one remains within the system of linguistic signifiers and never gets outside language to the referent, or what is typically called the transcendental signified. This is the meaning, or at least one of the meanings, of that famous statement that is so often associated with Derrida: there is nothing outside the text. And this is especially true for large language models, as there is quite literally nothing outside the texts on which they have been trained, and that they in turn generate from the input of a user prompt. We could therefore say, by way of remixing Wittgenstein, that for these generative AI systems, the limits of their language model mean the limits of their world. Consequently, what has been offered as a criticism of large language model technology, namely that these algorithms only circulate different signs without access to the real-world embodied reference, might not be the indictment critics think it is. Large language models are post-structuralist machines that deconstruct the defining conceptual oppositions of classical semiotics. Large language models are a significant challenge because what we now have with these technologies are things that write without speaking, a proliferation of texts that do not have nor are beholden to the authoritative voice of an author, and statements the truth of which cannot be anchored in and assured by a prior intention to say something. From one perspective, a perspective that remains bound to the epoch of logocentrism, this can only be seen as a threat and a crisis. What is on the line and in the crosshairs is our very understanding of language and the meaning of literature. The future of writing and human communication seems to be in jeopardy. But from another perspective, one which follows the deconstruction of this tradition that had been developed and documented in 20th century literary theory, this is an opportunity to think beyond and in excess of the limitations of Western metaphysics and its hegemony. Understood in this way, large language models and generative AI do not threaten writing, the figure of the author, or the concept of truth. They only threaten a particular and limited conceptualization, one that is itself not some naturally occurring phenomenon, but the product of a particular culture and philosophical tradition. Consequently, Instead of being misunderstood as signs of the apocalypse or the end of writing, large language models and generative AI reveal the limits of the logocentric privilege, participate in a deconstruction of its organizing principles, and open the opportunity to think and to write differently. In the end, the future of writing depends on how we understand and theorize what is meant by the word writing. If we understand and take it literally, that is, as the process of arranging words or linguistic tokens in linear sequence on some tangible medium, then writing will indeed continue well into the future. But who or what does that writing, and how that affects the meaning of any particular piece of written content, is a question that is and has actually always been in flux and dynamic. Large language models simply render all of this legible.